The moment that changes everything does not begin with a missile launch. It begins with crowds in the streets. What started as scattered economic protests inside Iran has now evolved into the most dangerous geopolitical escalation the Middle East has seen since the June 2025 strikes on Iran's nuclear program. According to multiple human rights organizations and regional security assessments, Iran is no longer dealing with routine civil unrest. It is facing a nationwide uprising and responding as if it is already at war. Court records, medical reports, and statements from international watchdogs indicate that Iran's security forces have killed at least 2,500 civilians since late December. Some internal estimates cited by regional human rights networks place the real number far higher, potentially in the five-figure range. Legal analysts note that even the conservative figures already surpass any protest-related death toll since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. This matters because scale changes intent, and intent changes everything. According to economic data tracked by international financial institutions, Iran's currency has effectively collapsed over the past decades, losing orders of magnitude of its value since the founding of the Islamic Republic. What began on December 28, 2025, as protests over prices and wages rapidly transformed into something far more politically dangerous. Reports from all 31 provinces show synchronized demonstrations with unified slogans rejecting Iran's regional proxy strategy and clerical rule itself. Legal scholars who monitor Iranian constitutional structures note that these chants directly challenge the ideological foundation of the state, not just its policies. Once protests cross that threshold, regimes do not negotiate. They choose survival. According to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, Iranian authorities initially deployed riot control units. That phase ended quickly. By early January, eyewitness testimony collected by international media described the use of live ammunition, metal pellets, and coordinated military-style clearing operations. Medical professionals inside Tehran and Shiraz told international outlets that hospitals were overwhelmed by gunshot victims. Doctors described what international humanitarian law experts would classify as mass casualty conditions, a term typically reserved for wartime environments. The decisive turning point came when Iran imposed a nationwide internet and communications blackout. Legal analysts say this tactic is not about crowd control. It is about information denial, a method historically associated with mass atrocity concealment. According to human rights documentation, casualty reporting effectively stopped after the blackout. That absence of data is not neutral. It is a warning signal. Iran, S judiciary then removed all ambiguity. State television aired warnings that protesters could face capital punishment under charges such as enmity against God. Prosecutors publicly announced expedited trials with no leniency. Legal experts emphasize that under Iranian law, these declarations function as pre-authorization for executions. Court observers note another critical detail: televised confessions by minors. International law experts describe this as a classic indicator of impending show trials designed to terrorize a population into submission. At this stage, the regime was no longer signaling law enforcement. It was signaling regime defense at any cost. Despite the brutality, evidence suggests the crackdown is not fully cohesive. Statements released by Iranian security institutions themselves referenced abandonment and non-compliance. Kurdish human rights organizations reported arrests of officers who allegedly refused orders to fire on civilians. Analysts, familiar with authoritarian collapse patterns, stress this point. Regimes fall not when people protest, but when security forces hesitate. That hesitation appears to be growing. Facing internal fractures, Iranian leadership shifted its narrative outward. According to official statements broadcast on state media, authorities framed the protests as an extension of foreign aggression linked to the June 2025 Israel-Iran conflict. Officials allege foreign arms caches, terrorist infiltration, and covert operations, claims presented without independently verifiable evidence. Strategically, this reframing serves a purpose. If protests are defined as foreign-backed warfare, then lethal military response becomes not just permissible, but obligatory. This is where domestic repression intersects with international escalation. President Donald Trump's public statements dramatically altered the risk calculus. According to White House press briefings and verified media reports, Trump warned Iran against executing detained protesters and stated that help is on its way. He also established a clear red line: any Iranian attack on American forces would trigger overwhelming retaliation. Legal analysts note the consequence of such language. Once issued, credibility demands follow through. The New York Times and Wall Street Journal reported that Trump received classified briefings outlining strike options, not only against nuclear facilities, but against internal security and command infrastructure associated with repression. This is a fundamental shift. It signals that Washington is considering intervention tied directly to internal Iranian violence, not just strategic weapons programs. According to open-source intelligence and defense reporting, the United States has deployed a familiar but highly specific combination of assets to the region: stealth fighters, strategic bombers, and aerial refueling aircraft. Defense analysts emphasize that this configuration is not symbolic. It enables sustained operations deep inside Iran. Without aerial refueling capacity, such campaigns are impossible. Even more concerning, diplomats confirmed that some U.S. personnel were instructed to evacuate a major regional base. Evacuations are not threats. They are preparations. History matters here. In June 2025, Iran responded to U.S. strikes by launching missiles at that same installation. Strategic planners on both sides remember that precedent. Iran does not bluff about retaliating against bases it considers operationally relevant. Iran, quote, parliamentary leadership then crossed a rhetorical line. Public statements asserted the right to strike U.S. forces preemptively based on perceived threat indicators rather than actual attacks. Legal scholars note that this represents a doctrinal shift from retaliation to anticipatory warfare. In practical terms, this means that visible American preparations, aircraft deployments, evacuations, logistics, could themselves trigger Iranian strikes. This is how wars begin without declarations. The shadow of the June 2025 operation looms over every decision. According to Pentagon assessments, U.S. stealth bombers penetrated Iranian airspace undetected and destroyed deeply buried nuclear facilities using weapons no other country possesses. While initial estimates downplayed the impact, later intelligence concluded the strikes set Iran's nuclear program back years. Iran has vowed not to allow a repeat. That vow matters because Iran has demonstrated both capability and willingness to launch mass missile attacks, not only against Israel, but against U.S. assets. Strategic stability depends on restraint. Restraint is exactly what is disappearing. From Washington's perspective, tolerating mass killings after public promises of support would destroy U.S. credibility. Adversaries would learn that American warnings carry no cost. From Tehran's perspective, allowing protests to continue risks regime collapse and personal annihilation for its leadership. Concessions are existentially dangerous. Both sides believe backing down is more dangerous than escalation. That is the definition of a collision course. What turns a crisis into a war is rarely a single decision. It is a chain reaction, driven by fear, miscalculation, and actors who believe time is running out. That is exactly where the Iran crisis now stands. At this stage, neither Washington nor Tehran appears to actively want a full-scale war. But strategic history shows that wars often begin not because leaders seek them, but because events remove every alternative. According to regional security analysts, the danger no longer lies in official policy statements. It lies in trigger events. Incidents that force both sides to act even if restraint would be preferable. And several such triggers are already in motion. Multiple intelligence-linked reports indicate that armed ethnic and separatist groups are exploiting the chaos inside Iran. Kurdish militant organizations have publicly claimed attacks on Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps positions in western provinces. While independent verification remains limited, the claims themselves matter. Legal and strategic analysts emphasize this point. Perception is operational reality. If Iranian leadership believes protests are evolving into an armed insurgency, especially one it can frame as foreign-backed, then the justification for extreme force becomes internal law rather than international politics. This creates a deadly feedback loop. Protests generate repression. Repression generates armed resistance. Armed resistance justifies military escalation. At that point, Iran no longer needs proof of American involvement. It only needs plausibility. From a purely military perspective, the United States could avoid direct involvement by limiting its actions to rhetoric and sanctions. But politically and strategically, that option is eroding. According to former U.S. national security officials interviewed by major outlets, Trump's public commitment to Iranian protesters has already crossed a line. When a U.S. president publicly promises protection and consequences, failure to act carries costs far beyond Iran. Those costs include loss of deterrence credibility. Encouragement of adversaries to test U.S. red lines. Internal political backlash at home. Legal analysts point out that credibility is not an abstract concept in international relations. It is the currency that prevents conflict. Once spent, it cannot be reclaimed without action. For Iran's ruling elite, the calculation is even starker. Allowing protests to succeed would not mean reform. It would mean regime collapse. Senior figures understand that post-revolutionary accountability could involve imprisonment or execution. That reality shapes every decision. Reports from inside Iran suggest that real power has shifted further away from elected institutions and toward security hardliners. The supreme leader's reduced public presence and reliance on intermediaries signal fear, not confidence. Political scientists who study authoritarian breakdown note a critical pattern. When leaders believe they may not survive politically, they behave as if they may not survive physically. That mindset makes compromise almost impossible. Iran's declaration that it reserves the right to strike first based on objective signs of threat introduces extreme instability. Military planners on both sides understand the danger. If evacuation orders, aircraft deployments, or logistics movements are interpreted as imminent attack preparations, they can trigger preemptive action. This is known in strategic doctrine as the security dilemma at its most volatile, where defensive measures appear offensive to the other side. Once this cycle begins, timing becomes everything. Whoever strikes first gains advantage. Waiting becomes riskier than acting. The June 2025 strikes are not history. They are a live reference point. The United States demonstrated the ability to destroy hardened Iranian facilities with impunity. Iran demonstrated the willingness to retaliate directly against U.S. assets in civilian areas. Neither side can forget those lessons. Pentagon assessments confirm that similar strike packages are now visible again. Iranian missile forces remain intact enough to cause mass disruption, even if they cannot win a conventional war. This balance does not create stability. It creates pressure. Israel's position adds another layer of complexity. Israeli leadership has repeatedly stated it will not allow Iran to reconstitute its nuclear or long-range missile programs. Any perception that Iran is rebuilding under cover of chaos could trigger unilateral Israeli action. Such an action would almost certainly pull the United States in, either directly or indirectly, regardless of Washington's intentions. Regional analysts warn that Hezbollah, militias in Iraq, and proxy groups across the region are watching closely. A single strike could activate multiple fronts simultaneously. This would not be a contained conflict. It would be regional war. The Iran crisis does not exist in isolation. China has already signaled opposition to expanded U.S. sanctions and has economic incentives to keep Iran within its strategic orbit. Russia, engaged elsewhere, benefits from U.S. distraction and instability in energy markets. NATO planners quietly acknowledge that escalation in the Middle East would stretch American attention at a moment when Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Korean Peninsula remain unresolved. This is how regional crises become global ones. Not by intention, but by overlap. Diplomatic channels reportedly remain open, but their effectiveness is questionable. From Washington's perspective, talks risk legitimizing mass repression. From Tehran's perspective, talks risk signaling weakness to protesters and security forces alike. Both sides fear that diplomacy buys time for the other, not peace. The mutual suspicion is lethal. Iran now faces two existential threats simultaneously. Internal collapse driven by mass unrest. External confrontation driven by deterrence failure. Historically, regimes facing this dilemma often choose external conflict. War shifts attention, justifies repression, and reframes legitimacy in nationalist terms. Strategic analysts warn that this logic is dangerous but familiar. If Iranian leadership concludes that regime survival requires changing the narrative from government versus people to nation versus foreign enemy, then striking U.S. or allied targets becomes rational. Even if catastrophic. For the United States, intervention carries massive risk, and non-intervention carries massive reputational cost. Limited strikes may fail to deter. Large strikes may trigger uncontrollable escalation. There is no clean option. What remains is management of risk, hoping that no actor miscalculates, no proxy overreaches, and no single incident forces irreversible decisions. History suggests that hope is not a strategy. As of now, protests continue despite mass repression. Iran's security forces show signs of internal strain. The United States has positioned forces capable of immediate action. Iran has publicly authorized preemptive attacks. Regional actors stand ready to exploit chaos. This is not a frozen crisis. It is a moving one. Every day without resolution increases the probability that someone, state or non-state, takes an action that collapses all remaining restraint. And once that happens, the question will no longer be whether war begins, but how far it spreads. That is the true danger of the Iran crisis in 2026. Not that leaders want war, but that the system they are trapped in may no longer allow peace.